August 9, 1945. A Soviet army closes in on Manchuria. Inside a Japanese military compound near the city of Harbin, doctors are moving fast. They're destroying records. They're burning buildings. They're killing witnesses. Not to cover up a weapons facility or a strategic bunker. They're erasing evidence of an institution where at least 3,000 human beings, mostly Chinese prisoners, Korean slaves, and Russian soldiers, were systematically infected with plague, anthrax, typhoid, and cholera, then dissected while still alive. To see what happened. The Japanese government would deny this happened for decades. The Soviet Union knew and said nothing. The United States knew and made a deal. Today, you'll discover how the most horrific medical facility of the Second World War was hidden in plain sight, protected by geopolitics, and why the architects of that horror walked free. According to declassified U.S. military records, Soviet intelligence files, and testimony from survivors and perpetrators, recorded by historians Sheldon Harris and Hal Gold. This is the verified history of Unit 731. In the next 10 minutes, you'll discover how a legitimately trained physician became the orchestrator of the deadliest biological weapons program ever created. You'll see the exact mechanism used to justify industrialized human experimentation. And you'll learn the single decision that allowed hundreds of war criminals to escape justice and integrate into post-war Japanese society and American intelligence networks. The evidence exists in archives. The people involved are named. Let's go. His name was Shiro Ishihara. Born 1892 in Saitama Prefecture, Japan. He was not a sadist discovered late in life. He was methodical. He earned a medical degree from Kyoto Imperial University in 1916. He published academic papers on infectious disease. In the 1920s, during Japan's campaign in Manchuria, Ishihara observed something that changed him. Japanese soldiers were dying from epidemic typhus faster than they were dying from bullets. In 1932, the Imperial Japanese Army created a secret research unit under the official cover of the Kwantung Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. This was the lie written on the paperwork. The reality was that the facility, soon to be called Unit 731, would become a sprawling complex of over 150 buildings located in Pingfang, a suburb of Harbin, occupying an area of 6 square kilometers. Ishihara was appointed director. He was given unlimited resources and one explicit directive from his military superiors: develop biological weapons before the enemy does. The United States was developing them. The Soviet Union was developing them. Imperial Japan could not afford to fall behind. But a problem emerged quickly. You cannot test a plague bomb on a theoretical population. You need test subjects. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria had produced thousands of prisoners. Chinese resistance fighters, suspected communists, Korean independence activists, and Russian soldiers stranded along the border. By 1940, Unit 731 had developed a supply chain. Prisoners were transported in specially marked trains. They arrived at the facility labeled as Marutas. That word means logs of wood. The first experiments were designed to answer a single question: how do you weaponize a disease? It sounds abstract. The implementation was not. Plague-infected fleas were bred in laboratory cultures. Researchers would deliberately infect prisoners with plague, then carefully observe the progression: the fever stage, the bubo stage, the pneumonic stage. Some prisoners were infected through inhalation, some through injection. The data had to be precise because the military application demanded precision. You cannot deploy a biological weapon if you do not understand exactly how it spreads, at what temperature it dies, how long it survives in water, and what the lethal dose is. This required killing the subject to examine the internal organs. In medical language, this is called vivisection. The prisoner would be anesthetized sometimes, often not. Then the cavity would be opened and organs removed while the heart still beat. This was documented. Dr. Masashi Kitano, who later became deputy director, recorded in his own notes that the goal was to obtain fresh specimens for pathological examination. Fresh meant alive, but something shifted the scale of horror. In 1943, military command issued a new directive: begin offensive capability testing. Ishihara and his staff were ordered to develop not just defensive knowledge about biological weapons, but actual delivery systems. How would you spread plague across an enemy city? The answer came from Lieutenant Masayoshi Mizuguchi, a weapons designer attached to the unit. His innovation was elegant and catastrophic: porcelain bombs. Ceramic shells filled with plague-infected fleas or cholera cultures. They would be dropped on a target. The impact would rupture the shell. The insects or contaminated material would scatter across an area. The population would be infected within days. They tested these devices on prisoners. Infected prisoners were placed in chambers at varying distances from detonation points. The blast radius was measured against infection rates. The data was recorded. Everything was documented because this was science, just science conducted on human beings, classified as non-human by virtue of their race and military status. But a newly declassified U.S. Army intelligence memo from 1946 shows the problem was even worse than the military realized. Ishihara had expanded the program beyond plague and cholera. Unit 731 was weaponizing diseases specifically selected because they had no natural presence in targeted populations. Japanese soldiers could theoretically be vaccinated and survive. Enemy populations could not. By 1945, the facility had killed more people in human experimentation than Japan's biological warfare missions had killed on the battlefield. The experiments were failing to produce reliable weapons, but they were succeeding at producing one thing: data. An archive of human suffering converted into scientific notation. What we know about what happened inside Unit 731 comes from multiple testimony streams, and they corroborate. We have survivor testimony. We have perpetrator confessions recorded during Soviet interrogation. We have autopsy reports documented by Japanese pathologists who were themselves stationed there. A survivor named Liu Jiwen, a Chinese resistance fighter captured in 1941, described in a recorded testimony from 1952 what he witnessed in the plague division. They tied people to chairs. They injected the culture directly into the arm or the abdomen. For plague, most died within 2 to 3 weeks. Some lasted longer. The screaming never changed. Only the voice got weaker. Researcher Yoshijiro Umezu, who operated the vivisection theater, kept a personal journal. Portions of it survived and were translated by historian Hal Gold. A single entry from March 1944 reads, Subject 24, female, age 17, Chinese. Plague infection, day 18. Internal organs now in advanced state of liquefaction. Proceeded with full abdominal examination under conditions of minimal anesthesia to observe physiological response. Subject expired during procedure. What you're reading is the destruction of a human being written in the bureaucratic language of scientific inquiry. But the worst part is a detail that most people miss. Unit 731 was not a rogue operation. It was integrated into the military hierarchy. Ishihara reported directly to the Kwantung Army Command. The Kwantung Army reported to Imperial General Headquarters. Documents show that the Emperor's own military advisors were briefed on the progress of biological weapons development. Not everyone involved in the Japanese military knew the details, but those at the top did know that Unit 731 existed and that it produced biological weapons data through human experimentation. In 1944, a plague outbreak actually occurred in the facility itself, an accident, or possibly sabotage, no one knows. Multiple researchers and guards died. The outbreak was contained by executing infected individuals and sterilizing the affected buildings. The incident was reported up the chain of command. No order to cease operations was issued. By 1945, Unit 731 had become a death factory optimized for a single output. Knowledge obtained through murder, organized systematically, filed and archived. Shiro Ishihara had transformed a medical problem, how to protect soldiers from epidemic disease, into a blueprint for mass killing disguised as research. For decades after 1945, the official historical narrative was straightforward. The Russians captured Unit 731, arrested Ishihara and his senior staff, held trials, and executed the perpetrators. Justice, however delayed, was served. That was the lie told in Moscow. That was the lie accepted in Washington. In 1956, a Soviet court did try Ishihara and 11 other senior Unit 731 commanders. They were convicted. Ishihara was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. He was sent to a Soviet POW camp. But in 1956, Japan and the Soviet Union normalized relations. As part of the diplomatic agreement, prisoners were repatriated. Shiro Ishihara was released. He returned to Japan. He lived freely. He died of natural causes in 1959, at age 67. He was never tried by any other nation. The United States never prosecuted him. Japan, under occupation by American forces, did not prosecute him. This is where the darker truth emerges. In 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Manchuria, the United States realized something. The biological weapons data produced by Unit 731 was scientifically valuable. 3 years of human experimentation had produced information that American researchers would have to accumulate through conventional methods which would take decades and would face intense ethical scrutiny. In September 1945, a U.S. biological warfare officer named Colonel Murray Sanders arrived at Unit 731 before Soviet forces could fully secure the area. His mission, documented in declassified memos, was to obtain records and conduct preliminary interviews with key researchers before the Soviets could move them. The American strategy became clear: obtain the data, protect the scientists, grant immunity. Between 1945 and 1948, American occupation authorities negotiated directly with Ishihara. The terms were never made public. The deal was, you provide us with comprehensive documentation of all Unit 731 research, biological weapons tests, and methodologies. In return, the United States will not prosecute you. You will not be extradited. You will be protected from international war crimes proceedings. Ishihara accepted. He provided materials. He provided testimony. The information was classified. It was filed away in American biological warfare archives, where it remained classified for decades. Meanwhile, at least 300 other Unit 731 staff members, researchers, doctors, technicians, were quietly integrated back into Japanese medical institutions. Some became university professors. Some became doctors in private practice. Some got jobs in pharmaceutical research. The Takeda Pharmaceutical Company explicitly recruited former Unit 731 researchers. The Japanese government's post-war health ministry employed them. In the official Japanese records, their wartime experience was omitted or redescribed as military medical research. No mention of human subjects. No mention of experimentation. The American decision was based on Cold War logic. The Soviet Union also had biological weapons programs. The United States needed the data more than it needed justice. A captured Ishihara facing trial would be a liability. A cooperating Ishihara, granted immunity, providing detailed scientific documentation, was an asset. What happened to the principals? Shiro Ishihara died in 1959, never facing trial. His subordinates lived equally charmed post-war lives. Dr. Masashi Kitano, who personally conducted vivisection experiments, became a professor at Gunma University and published peer-reviewed medical papers. He died in 1956, again, from natural causes, never prosecuted. Yoshijiro Umezu, who operated the vivisection theater and documented his actions in journals, was found living in Tokyo in the 1970s. Historians approached him for interviews about his wartime activities. He refused to discuss it. He died in 1974. Of the entire senior leadership of Unit 731, exactly 0 were executed. 0 were imprisoned by the United States or Japan. The Soviet conviction and imprisonment of Ishihara lasted less than a decade before repatriation ended it. The data, however, was not lost. American biological warfare research benefited directly from Unit 731 documentation. Historians have traced specific methodologies and findings from Unit 731 into American biological weapons development programs conducted at Fort Detrick and other facilities during the Cold War. The most direct legacy is this. When the United States signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, an international treaty banning biological weapons development, the decision to prosecute Unit 731 veterans had long since passed. The statute of limitations on the crimes had expired. The perpetrators were dead or untouchable, but the data lived on. The scientific knowledge extracted through torture and murder was preserved and remained classified for decades. It was only in the 1990s and 2000s that declassification and investigative journalism began to expose what had happened. By that time, nearly all witnesses, survivors, and perpetrators alike were dead. The last perpetrator alive was Nobuo Ishii, not a commander but a researcher who personally conducted plague experiments. He lived until 2004. In his final years, he gave limited interviews but refused to discuss specifics. He died at age 84, still maintaining silence. The survivor testimony is where the true reckoning occurs. Liu Jiwen, the resistance fighter who survived, spent the rest of his life in a state hospital for psychiatric care, suffering from what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD. He died in 1961. Other survivors faced lifelong health complications, organ damage, chronic infections, infertility. They were forbidden from discussing their experiences by Japanese authorities who wanted the history erased. But here is what remains unresolved. In 1945, as Unit 731 was being destroyed, Ishihara gave an order. Documents show that before the facility was evacuated, researchers were instructed to conduct a final wave of experiments using remaining subjects. The goal was to extract maximum data in minimum time before destruction. The exact number of prisoners killed in those final days is unknown. Estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000. The facility burned. Records were destroyed. Soviet forces arrived and found ash and bones and empty chambers. But not all records burned. Some documents survived and were eventually obtained by historians. In 1995, Sheldon Harris published the most comprehensive historical account of Unit 731 based on declassified sources. In 2000, Japanese researcher Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered documents in the Japanese National Diet Library that had been hidden for 50 years. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not produce the justice you might expect. There were no prosecutions. There was no international tribunal. In Japan itself, the history of Unit 731 became a subject of fierce historical debate, with some nationalist politicians arguing the experiments were exaggerated or that such research was necessary for military survival. The most disturbing detail? It's documented, it's verified. It's in the historical record. Unit 731 was not an anomaly of Japanese militarism. It was a logical extension of the dehumanization required by total war. And when that war ended, the technology and the knowledge were too valuable to destroy. So they were preserved. The perpetrators walked free because what they produced was wanted. That's the story. The sources are in the description. Fact check me. This is what happens when survival trumps conscience. When data becomes more important than the bodies it was extracted from. When geopolitics decides that some war crimes are too useful to prosecute. We'll see you in the next one.